GGG have made a post for what they're working on for Keepers of the Flame. We're about 1 week into patch 3.27 at this point, and there's one really exciting piece of news in this post, which is we have another batch of Foulborn uniques which didn't quite make it into launch and will be going in with the next restart patch. Now, the next restart patch is likely to be next week, because they say here that they plan to deploy some of these changes along with additional fixes and improvements next week, and part of those fixes and improvements there is actually in regards to some complaints that players have been having in terms of loot from the current patch, and also the breach encounters themselves, particularly the Hive encounter there where you need to defend Aelith in maps, and that one is a little bit frustrating when it comes with kind of overlapping other mechanics in different maps. And so they say here that they're investigating an option to allow for a large number of walls to be destroyed at the start of that encounter, which I think would be a kind of good workaround fix for the current league. And they also say here that they are reassessing the rewards from breach monsters in map areas with an eye towards making the league mechanic encounters more rewarding directly, and thus worth the time to actually engage with. Now, one of the complaints that players have been having about the current patch is just general loot. Not particularly the league mechanic itself, but just generally loot drops not being great. And I think one of the things that is going on there is actually the comparison of this league compared to the last league, where everyone was running around with a mercenary, therefore they had kind of buffed general loot drops, everything was kind of buffed up, and your merc was kind of giving you a lot of power there, so you didn't really notice the difficulty increase, but you definitely did notice the loot increase that they were providing to you because you were essentially in a party, and you were gaining those party bonuses. But regardless, they are going to be doing some changes, some fixes there to the current league, and also some improvements to the rewards, so look forward to that patch. But I am very, very excited to see what new Foulborn uniques are going to be coming into the game next week. That is going to be really interesting to see if there's any particularly strong build-defining uniques. And speaking of those build-defining uniques, in this video I want to go over more of the Foulborn items. Beginning with Kintsugi. Now, this is a unique body armor, and the way this body armor works is that usually it kind of rewards you for building avoidance layers so that when you actually do take damage, you take a lot less damage as a result. So, for example, stacking up true avoidance layers like evasion or dodge will reward you with having 35% less damage taken if you haven't been hit in the last 4 seconds. And that is just a less damage taken modifier. As long as you haven't been hit in the last 4 seconds, it also works for damage over time if you're standing on, like, a ground dot from Uber Elder or the Maven encounter, for example. You will just take 35% less damage from that as long as you haven't been hit in the last 4 seconds. Now, Kintsugi has a Foulborn version which replaces this modifier right here with a suppressed spell damage modifier. So prevent 35% of suppressed spell damage if you have not suppressed spell damage recently. So base suppression in this patch was nerfed from 50% down to 40%, which means that with this modifier active, you will prevent 75% of suppressed spell damage when you actually do take a spell for the first time in 4 seconds. Now, the crazy thing about this one here is that it may look like a little bit of a nerf, because the original modifier here actually interacts with all damage types, right? If you actually take an attack hit for the first time in 4 seconds, it will lessen that attack hit. And if you're standing on a ground dot, like I said, and you haven't been hit in the last 4 seconds, it will lessen that damage. And it's the same for spells as well. But the important thing to note here is that that's a less damage taken modifier, which is multiplicative damage reduction. The prevent plus 35% of suppressed spell damage is an additive reduction on top of your suppressed spell damage modifier. And you can stack it up even further. For example, the Trickster has a notable for plus 15% suppressed spell damage while on full energy shield. And then there's the Spell Suppression Mastery for plus 3% of suppressed damage. There's also the Inveterate notable for another 3%. And you can get items such as Hinakora's Sight for up to 6% suppressed spell damage, and there's actually more modifiers you can get there on other equipment pieces. Now, notably, the reason why this is so strong is because it removes the flexibility from Kintsugi. The flexibility there is that it works, like I said, for all different damage types, and this one only works for incoming suppressed spells. So you will have to deal with attack hits and ground dots and things like that in other ways. But this can be a really, really strong modifier to allow you to tank some ridiculously large spell hits from Uber bosses and things like that. And I want to kind of highlight something else here, which is the other Foulborn modifier on Kintsugi. Now, this one replaces the increased evasion rating if you have been hit recently, and it's 20 to 30% to chance to suppress spell damage if you've suppressed spell damage recently. Now, this modifier might sound like it's really weak, and for the most part it's much weaker than the other modifier, but the important thing here is some tech that you can use with this modifier, and that is part of the Spell Suppression Mastery. Now, there's a Spell Suppression Mastery here which is prevent plus 1% of suppressed spell damage per hit suppressed recently, and minus 2% chance to suppress spell damage per hit suppressed recently. So the idea of this modifier here is that you can kind of overcap your spell suppression chance and benefit more and more from the suppressed spell damage modifier if you're being shotgunned by spells or taking a lot of spells in a rapid succession. But the Kintsugi Foulborn modifier there only adds to your chance to suppress spell damage if you've actually suppressed a spell damage hit recently. So once you actually suppress that first spell, that's where this modifier will come into play, and you'll suppress it massively, right? It will be 75% or more. And then after that, this modifier is gone for the next 4 seconds. But that's when this modifier kicks in, and it overcaps your spell suppression. Let's say you already had 100% without this modifier, well now you have 120 or 130% chance to suppress spell damage. And this is not going to be very useful most of the time, because a lot of the time you are not just tanking lots of spell hits in quick succession. But there is a weakness here with Kintsugi, which is that this really only works for that one big spell that you take once every 4 seconds or more. Whereas this one here, combined with the Mastery, actually does something in a scenario where you're being hit by lots of spells. For example, a boss that does lots of hits, like the Maven's Cascade of Pain, or just in a general map where you're being hit by lots of spells from the same pack of monsters. That first spell will be suppressed a lot, and then you'll continuously gain more and more damage reduction the more spells you get hit by, but as long as you don't get hit by 10 or 15 spells in a row, then you'll still have fully capped out spell suppression, and you'll just be taking less and less damage from each subsequent spell hit within that 4-second period. So that is a bit of interesting tech there to make use of that spell suppression mastery. Now next up is Gruthkul's Pelt, which is a rare body armor that is usually just not really used outside of Animate Guardians, and this one is basically providing you a big chunk of global physical damage. There's a huge amount of life regen here, which is one of the main reasons there why it's used on Animate Guardian, and then of course there's some flat life there which isn't very useful on Animate Guardian. But the reason there that this isn't used on characters is because it has those 2 lines at the bottom there. Spell skills are disabled and spell skills deal no damage. Those 2 modifiers basically prevent this from being used on the majority of builds. The first one there, the spell skills deal no damage, well, that means that you can't do any kind of spell damage build. But the second one is the more punishing one, because so many things in this game are spells. Even things that you wouldn't really expect to be spells are spells. For example, banners are spells, aspect skills are spells, stances are spells like Flesh and Stone, Blood and Sand. And of course, all of the reservation skills, all of the auras, they're all spells. So this basically prevents you from doing any kind of normal build setup where you're reserving your mana for powerful effects. Now, the Foulborn version of Gruthkul's Pelt replaces the Disable Spells modifier with Your Warcries are disabled. Now, notably, it doesn't remove the Blocking of Spells dealing damage modifier. That is still going to be existent on this Gruthkul's Pelt, but you are going to be able to use skills and actually reserve spells against your mana and benefit from those spells, as long as they're not dealing damage themselves. So for example, aura skills like Determination or Haste, you'll be able to fully benefit from those, and even skills that provide you with extra damage, like Anger, as long as it actually doesn't deal the damage itself, you're going to be able to benefit from that aura. Now there's a couple of things I want to mention about this. First is the use of this on a build that doesn't need to deal damage itself. For example, a minion build or something that kind of acts as a support for other characters. And the other use case there is, of course, on an attack build that doesn't use Warcries, especially if you want to somehow benefit from that massive life regeneration modifier, which is easily the largest amount of life regeneration you can get on a body armor. I think the next highest is the 4th Vow at 3%, so this is just ridiculous at 10%. Next up is Vol's Vision. Now this item provides a huge amount of base life regeneration there, 400 if you have no equipped items that are corrupted. And this item was very good when people were using the Calm's Glove for rage generation, but that item was nerfed. Now the Foulborn version of this item has gain 8 to 12% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield if no equipped items are corrupted. That is a huge amount of this modifier. To put that into comparison, the notable on the passive tree, Melding, provides just 3% of this stat, and then the Corrupted Soul Timeless Keystone provides 15%, but it comes with the modifier there that then makes half of the damage actually bypass Energy Shield, which is sometimes of benefit and sometimes not so much. And this item is just really good on an Inquisitor, because you kind of want to stack up life and Energy Shield, and you're still going to benefit from that 400 regenerated life per second with this modifier combined, so you have a huge amount of regen for your life and your Energy Shield. But Vol's Vision also has another modifier here which replaces the life regeneration, which is 15 to 20% of life regeneration also applies to Energy Shield if no equipped items are corrupted. Now, this is something that's not for an Inquisitor, it's something that's going to be for a different kind of class, a different kind of setup there, but this can enable a hybrid life and Energy Shield build on a setup that kind of stacks a lot of life regeneration. One thing that comes to mind there is Righteous Fire Chieftain, where you're able to get an extreme amount of life recovery, and you can actually benefit there from stacking a lot of Energy Shield on top of your life because you also gain damage from that in terms of your Righteous Fire damage. And with enough recovery, you can potentially keep both of these resources topped off all of the time. To do that, you would actually need to make use of the Corrupted Soul Keystone, because then the Righteous Fire damage that's coming into you would actually be split half on your life and half on your Energy Shield, and that means that you can kind of benefit from the recovery on both resources there to be able to keep them both topped off. Moving on to a bit more of a meme item there, well, kind of a meme, is the Lionized Paws, which are boots that are not really used at all. And they have the Foulborn modifier there that replaces this downside with a fully upside modifier of 40% increased movement speed when on full life. You could make use of the Life Mastery there that makes it so that you count as being on full life whilst you have at least 90% of maximum life, which means you can benefit from a huge amount of movement speed. The boots actually have 20% on them baseline, so that's a total 60% increased movement speed boots. And lastly, I'll mention another kind of meme item, but this one is a bit less of a meme, I would say, which is the Moonbender's Wing. Now, this item normally is just a really weird one. It has a trigger lightning warp on hit, and then there's, some extra damage being gained from hits with this weapon for cold or lightning. And in this patch, you can actually gain a Foulborn one where the increased physical damage modifier, which is basically meaningless because this is such a low-level axe, is replaced with a massive increased attack speed modifier, up to 50% increased attack speed. And I actually have this weapon set up here in POB to actually simulate what this would look like, and 50% increased attack speed is a 2.25 APS weapon, which is just kind of ridiculous. That is really, really fast. And you can even get more attack speed on there from the Harvest quality craft as well if you wanted to. And the reason why I wanted to make note of this weapon is because it is actually really strong for Trauma or Boneshatter. The Trauma support gem provides flat physical damage there per Trauma, whilst the Boneshatter has a huge amount of flat physical damage already, and then you gain more damage per Trauma stack. Both of those have a lot of synergy with this axe, because the physical damage there is going to be gained as extra cold or lightning damage every hit on top of the damage that you already have. And then, of course, there's huge attack speed there to be able to build up a lot of trauma. And on top of that, you could even splash into crit if you wanted to, which is something that usually a Boneshatter or Trauma build doesn't do because you're using weapons that typically have a very low base crit. And there's a lot of interesting things you can do here. I mean, if you don't want to interact with the Lightning Warp on hit, you can actually cancel that one out by socketing in things like Archmage support, for example, and making it cost too much mana where you can't actually spend it, and therefore you can't trigger it. You could also do things like converting that Boneshatter or Trauma damage into an element like, fire or lightning or cold, and then you can actually use Trinity in the setup because you always have this huge chunk of extra damage being dealt as either cold or lightning, and that will be able to proc your Trinity support and make it deal a lot more damage and penetrate. So that's an interesting one you can look at there for a bit of a different spin on Trauma or Boneshatter. But that's going to be it for this video. I'm really excited to see what new Foulborn items are going to be coming into the game next week. And of course, I'll be going through those on this channel whenever they do get released, so stick around for that. That's going to be it for this one. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.